In the post-pulp era, the romance popes. Hello, my name's Gavin. This is Genre Books, and today I am in the superposition of being in and out of my comfort zone simultaneously. I'm talking about pulps, which I love. I'm talking about romance pulps, which are very new to me. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about Street and Smith's Love Story magazine, volume 121, issue 5. This is from January 1936. Love Story magazine is a proper success story within the pulps. In my series of Planet Stories, I'm doing a deep dive into a magazine that was published once every 3 months. Other science fiction magazines, detective magazines, Western stories may have been monthly. Some were bi-monthly. For 25 years, Love Story magazine was printed on a weekly basis. It began in August of 1921. So by the time this issue that I'm talking about today comes round, we've been 14 and a half years, and we're already at volume 121, issue number 5. The magazine was to continue until February of 1947, and in total there was 1,158 issues. I believe this did begin as a monthly pulp, but only for a couple of issues. The runaway success meant that it started to be cranked out on a weekly basis. And in the romance pulp genre, it was not alone. There were dozens of titles, some more successful than others, but I think in total there were 7,000 different issues of pulp romance magazines. So Love Story magazine takes up over a seventh of that total number. They began before 1921, and they continued until the last of the romance pulps, Ranch Romances, closed in 1971. Very, very late for a pulp to still be produced. So the competition to Love Story magazine was very strong. Every publishing house wanted a piece of that romance action, but Street and Smith were the biggest publishing beast for pulps out there. And it's their size and strength that allows them to produce on a weekly basis and thereby dominate the market. But for 20 years, or nearly 20 years, Love Story magazine had another, I'd say secret weapon. She wasn't so much of a secret. The editor was Daisy Bacon, who was at the helm for the weekly publication from 1929 until the magazine's closure. Daisy Bacon had moved to New York in 1917. She was aged 18 or 19 at that stage, and after a few jobs, she eventually got a job working on the staff of Love Story magazine in 1926 to work on the magazine's advice column. Within 2.5 years, she was editor, and it's the position that she kept for the remainder of the magazine's lifetime. She also found time during this tenure to edit Ainsley's magazine, Pocket Romance, Romantic Range, and Detective Story. After Love Story magazine ceased publication, they retained the services of Daisy Bacon at Street and Smith and transferred her to 2 flagship titles and names very familiar to any pulp fan: The Shadow and Doc Savage. And she remained as editor of those pulps until 1949. I think it was April of 1949, known as the day the pulps died, when Street and Smith closed the vast majority of the 19 pulp titles they were still producing. The pulps weren't dead yet, but this was perhaps the fatal blow. But let's talk about the magazine in its heyday. Its heyday really was the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, Love Story magazine was selling 400,000 to 600,000 copies week in, week out. Just the idea of editing a magazine for a quarter of a century on a weekly basis, putting out that volume of material, just sounds like such an undertaking. And it's not always easy being an editor and just choosing which are the best stories. There are a lot of serialized stories in Love Story magazine, which is a strength and a weakness. One particular weakness was a serial that wasn't finished by the author. I think it was one of their more famous contributors. I can't remember the lady's name. But they had printed 4 installments of the 6-part serial. They were ready to go with the 5th. The 6th had not yet arrived. So to give themselves a bit of time, they cut the 5th installment into 2. So weeks 5 and 6 were covered, and they'll just make it into a 7th. They're still waiting for this final piece. And again, the final piece didn't come. Daisy Bacon had to write the end of the serial herself. She had written romance stories before, which helped, but probably not the best position to be in to actually try and tie up the end of a long-running serial. But the serialization of stories is perhaps one of the weaknesses of the magazine's longevity. It's difficult to criticize a pulp magazine for its lack of longevity. It was never intended to be anything other than ephemeral. It is we modern readers and the people who do the collecting who have perpetuated, lionized, put some of these magazines on a pedestal, when the reality is these were just weekly magazines, never intended to be looked at, read and studied some 90 years later. In the post-pulp era, the romance pulps are largely forgotten, along with many of the writers. This is frustrating when you want to learn about the writers, because many of them don't have presence in the online world. It's difficult to find any information about them. I'm sure there is. If I wanted to spend the money on subscriptions and services, I could find out lots more biographical information. I really don't have the resources or time to do that currently. Not many pulp writers are household names, either in the general public, certainly not in the general public, but not even really in literary circles. But even within pulp circles, the writers of romance pulps are forgotten. Even the most famous, such as Penny Gaddis, aren't really names that are cited often when talking about pulps. Why is this? I think there are a few reasons. But first and foremost, let's be blunt, it's that these are love stories which don't always appeal to male readers, and it is the male readers and collectors of pulps that have perpetuated the pulp names after the cessation of publication. Interestingly, Love Story magazine had a fair proportion of male readers at the time of publication as well. It's just not something that has continued with modern interest. I'm part of the problem. I love pulp magazines. This is, I think, the first romance pulp that I've read. The fact that it was a weekly magazine, the fact that it was so successful and so long-lived, means that for a certain type of collector who must be a completionist, Love Story magazine is almost an impossibility. You're not going to get the collection of 1100 plus issues. If you do, and you're lucky enough to have it, they will take up such a lot of space. I think you'd have to be a very determined and deep-pocketed collector. And here is where the downside appears of having a disproportional amount of serialized stories. If you can't collect the whole thing, you'll want to collect certain issues, certain runs of issues. If a famous or comparatively famous story is set over 6 or more issues, it becomes much more difficult to collect. And the easier answer, therefore, for a collector may be not to start, rather than to make a beginning and suffer the wait between finding the issues, or worse still, getting 5 of the pieces of a serial together and not being able to find that final issue. This is a shame, because there is a lot to like in the magazine. I didn't expect to say that. I did not expect, to be honest, to enjoy it as much as I did. And not everything is great. This is not some glossy-eyed, romanticised version of a romance pulp. I also didn't read the serials. One was the last instalment, one was the second. Unless I can find online scans of the full run, I don't think I would bother. And that's a shame. This has, however, piqued my interest a little bit, and I might see what I can find online to build runs of this magazine together and do some more reading. So who is in this issue of Love Story magazine? Well, I mentioned Peggy Gaddis, and she is the top billed story here. But this is part of a serial. Erilee Pearl Gaddis, born in 1895, prolific writer. She's a 3,000 words a day lady, so a new book every 3 weeks. Roy, if you're listening, there's a lot of nurse books here. Bayou Nurse, Nora Was a Nurse, Nurse at Sundown, Young Nurse. So nurse romances are plenty. There's also a continuing story by Millicent Morland. So those are the 2 that I didn't read. For the single shot stories, we have Beulah Rhodes Overman, Fanny Lock Hatton, who is also the cover story for this magazine, Dorothy Ainsworth, Edna Frank Jones, Helen Brem Long, Rowena R. Farmer, Margaret Dollison, and Ulla Bunker. There's also some poetry interspersed with the stories, usually just to fill a third or quarter of a page that the story has left blank. I did read the poems. None of them particularly rocked my world. I think they are more likely to be found in a greeting card than they are in a poetry anthology. But that's my amateur opinion. There are certain hallmarks to these stories, or certainly the majority of them. You can tell this is written in the Great Depression. Now this is towards the end of the Great Depression, but its influence is still very much felt. The stories are pure escapism. The people involved are very often rich and very often, if not famous, at least glamorous. They are also, and maybe this is not surprising for 1936, uniformly white. Not only white, but they seem to be more alluring and attractive to everybody the paler they are, male or female. You may even say that non-white people will be notable by their absence, but they're not really absent. When they do turn up, they are in secondary characters and subservient roles, both literarily and literally. You do perhaps have the excuse of needing a maid if, like Josephine, the main character from The Heart Dictates, the opening story from Beulah Rhodes Overman, your job is a hand model. Josephine has an older sister who is overbearing and will not let her do any menial work, and she is the fiancée of a man who is the owner of a nail polish company. William, the fiancé, seems to be as enamoured of her hands as he is of her. But they are out in the country, having left the city, to a summer house where they are going to meet William's brother Philip. She has, on the street, already met Philip, I think at a post office, and they had taken an instant dislike to each other. As you'll learn from reading one of these magazines, instant dislikes don't stay as dislikes for very long. Philip is quite dismissive of Josephine. This gets her in a mood, and she tries to get out of this mood by going around and doing some housework. She is castigated for doing this because she may break a nail, so instead she goes out for a walk, where she comes across an ideal house, which turns out to be Philip's house. Philip is a farmer. He's dealing with an escaped pig. She tries to help capture the pig and ends up breaking a nail anyway. She's devastated by this. He can't see that it's so much of a big fuss. Anyway, that evening, William presents Josephine to Philip. She knows already who Philip is. Philip doesn't know who Josephine is, so she lords it over him at this dinner. During the course of dinner, however, Josephine's feelings begin to change. This is an odd little story. I'll come back to something a bit later in the magazine because we do see a repeated dynamic here between the male and female characters. Beulah Rhodes Overman not only wrote for Love Story magazine but also Liberty, Collier's, the Saturday Evening Post, so for the Slicks as well as the Pulps. She also wrote detective stories. So she's one of the more famous writers in the roster on this magazine. Possibly the most famous person, if not the most famous writer, is Fanny Lock Hatton, who wrote the cover story. Fanny Lock Hatton is much better known as a playwright and a screenwriter mostly for the silent films. With her husband, the most famous works they produced were Tonight or Never and Just a Gigolo. Here the story is The Dance of Danger, and we focus on Marilyn. Now, I didn't know what an adagio dancer was. I thought from the way that they were describing it, it was like a trapeze artist, but it's not quite that. It is sort of very energetic, not quite dancing. Marilyn seems to be getting thrown around the stage between two strapping young men. This is adagio dancing. But Marilyn has a problem. One of those strapping young men is in love with her, and she can't stand him. When you literally have your life in someone's hands, that's not a great position to be in. This is not made any better by the fact that on the same show as their dance is a very famous, popular singer-songwriter who has also taken a shine to Marilyn and whom Marilyn likes as well. The singer is tall, blonde, blue-eyed, and all the other characteristics that, you could say were appealing in 1936. You probably won't be seeing that very much in 1942 onwards. But from the get-go, the singer evidently likes Marilyn, shows it in a very funny way. He immediately doesn't want her to be dancing because it's dangerous. So he's quite overprotective and overbearing from the off. The other dancer, who also has an interest in her, is manipulative, controlling, and in the end ends up injuring her because in a fit of pique he basically drops her mid-act and she falls into the orchestra pit. People get hurt a lot physically in these romance stories. She is taken to hospital, and during her convalescence the singer visits her a lot. They fall in love, and even though she can't bear, she thinks, to be close to any man, she still agrees for some reason to marry the singer. People seem to get married very quickly in these stories, I have to say, and without much provocation or prior relationship. They may have a quick kiss beforehand, but they seal that kiss by going to the next stage, which is inevitably marriage. This is, after all, a romance pulp, not a spicy pulp. For the next 3 writers in this magazine, I could find out very little biographical information or more information about their works. Some of them seem to have written multiple stories for Love Story magazine. Others, I couldn't even find that. They seem to have left very little literary imprint. Whether they were writers who had a lot more stories printed, I really can't tell. The first of these is Dorothy Ainsworth, and the story is Little Heartbreaker. So this is a rural setting. The main love interest for 2 sisters is a doctor, and the dialogue here starts in the first few pages with some nice badinage. Our heroine is starting the story in a weird position. She'd been on a walk, had taken a dip in a lake because it was a very hot day, and had come out to find that gypsies had stolen her clothes. However, she finds this new doctor in town is fishing just down the way. She laughs at him because he's not going to catch any fish there. Quite why she's laughing at him when she is being caught out in wearing nothing, but a slip is not really explained, but she gets a lift home from him. And that's about as racy as the story gets. She's a fairly spoilt character. As it had been a hot day and she'd been left without her dress exposed, she got sunburnt and therefore can't go to any parties, and therefore feigns ankle injury and holes up in her room for the next 3 days. Meanwhile, she is sure that her sister is trying to make a move on the doctor, and the sister is doing so. The sister already has a fiancé. It gets a little bit complicated. She doesn't get invited to a beach party, decides to go anyway, but finds that her dastardly sister has let all the tyres down in her car. She then commandeers an ambulance to go to the party, hides in the ambulance and gets the driver of the ambulance to call the doctor over to say it's an emergency. When the doctor finds out the real reason, he's not happy. There are a number of miscommunications between the two, and also a fair amount of car accidents. I think there's probably about 3 different car accidents in this short story. So I think, yes, about 3 different car accidents, no lasting damage, and 2 marriages. Better Than Cupid by Edna Frank Jones. Now the Cupid in this case is either the terrier that brings the 2 main characters together, or the kidnappers that try to abduct the woman halfway through the story. This is a proper whirlwind romance. She is a wealthy heiress, so par for the course there. But she has lost her little dog. She finds out by backtracking, retracing her steps, where the dog had gone missing, and tracks down a local dog pound who says that the dog has been given to someone who is up the mountain in his summer house shack. He is also wealthy. I think he is the scion of a banking family. He pretends he doesn't know her, or maybe he actually doesn't know her. On the way up the mountain, she has had to fix a tyre. She is greasy, hot, sticky and flustered by the time she gets there, ill-tempered and really not looking like the social debutante she is. They immediately don't like each other, or so we are led to believe. As I said, this is a bit of a hallmark of these stories. This is proper whirlwind romance stuff because they are antagonistic towards each other, fighting over the dog, until such point that she suffers an attempted abduction by 2 people who had tracked her down to kidnap her to get money from her rich family. He shoots one in the shoulder and breaks the nose of the other one, and that's all the action you get in this story. This changes everything. She falls in love with him. They decide to get married. Even this early on in the magazine, I am finding a repetition here of behaviour which just wouldn't do in the modern world. On one hand, the heroes, the men in these stories, are very proper in that they won't take things too far with a woman before proposing marriage. To be honest, I don't think they take things nearly far enough before proposing marriage. But on the other hand, these guys seem to embody the old-fashioned phrase, treat them mean and keep them keen. And it seems to work, which is just not the message that you would like to see displayed these days. All those days, to be honest. But the women seem to fall for it. And these stories are written by women. So it's problematic on a lot of levels. I can't come in as a man and tell them how to write these stories. I am really not well versed in romance. I think it's something that in a longer form story might work better. Over time you'll see initial antagonism give way to affection. Possibly the confines of a short story give a different interpretation to this. It seems to be that the antagonism and the dismissiveness encourages this affection. Perhaps I've just picked the wrong issue of this magazine. Perhaps next Valentine's I'll read another one. Not that the bad behaviour is limited to just the men. In Helena Brem Long's Unhappy the Bride, the new bride is, apart from having a facial disfigurement that makes her look like Betty Boop, insanely jealous of her caddish husband, or husband-to-be. I think caddish is probably the right word for quite a few of the male characters in these stories. If this was a British magazine, we would be calling this lot a shower of bounders. In this story, we pack a lot of melodrama and action in. It's a crazy plot to cram into a short story. Attempted manslaughter, drowning, police investigations, more car crashes, and bigamy. It's only 10 pages. The next story is by Rowena R. Farah. Now I think this is Rowena Rutherford Farah, who in the 60s and the 70s does write a couple of novels. The Bend Your Heads All and A Wondrous Moment Then. Here we have a very short story. Campus Technique. This is about undergraduates, and in particular a female undergraduate who is stringing two men along at the same time and behaving pretty much abominably. Moreover, the men are twins, so I suppose she has the excuse that there's not a lot to choose between the two because they are identical. But she gets round this by instead falling for a third person who is a pilot who is literally just flown in for the party. There's not a lot more of the story than that. But I'm not quite sure if there's any lessons to be learned from this particular tale. There's part of a continuing serial from Millicent Morland called Passion of the Snows, which annoyingly is one I would have liked to look more at because it looked like to be a Northwest type romance, like Jack London with additional lovey-doveyness. The next standalone story we have is Margaret Dollison's She Answered Yes. More problematic old style romance. She is an independent woman, but succumbs to the charms of domesticity. I didn't much like this one. And it's only in the last story, Unforgettable Night by Una Bunker, that we find some people approaching normal. I say normal. We find some people who aren't independently and idly wealthy, although there are some in the book. we have someone who is sat on a literal gold mine. The gold mine had closed down decades previously, but with the recent uptick in gold prices, may be viable again. There is a rich love interest and there is a not rich love interest for the central heroine. The rich love interest, you'll be unsurprised, turns out to be another bounder. The non-rich character turns out to be the right choice. I don't think that's any great spoiler or surprise. He's also an old flame, the unforgettable knight of the title of the story, and the vague suggestion here that the unforgettable knight may be unforgettable for a couple of reasons. We have what seems to be the usual set of misunderstandings, but everything comes good in the end. I don't think any of these stories are great literature, but these are pulp stories and I'm not expecting it to be so. We quite often, when we're reading pulp stories in science fiction or detective, adventure or westerns, read these early efforts of authors in the light of the greater success we know that they will find. It just isn't the case here. So many of these writers have just not gone on to fulfill their dreams. Annoyingly, this may be life imitating art, where these independent writers, these women who are authors in their own right, may have succumbed to the joys of domesticity. Or maybe that is just the interpretation I am putting on it. You will find plenty of writers male writers in science fiction and western pulps who arrive, write a few stories, and you never hear of them again. It may be that they have the rest of their lives to get on with. They wanted to try writing a story, they get it out of their systems. It was only ever a hobby. It may have continued to be a hobby. Given the Herculean efforts we can see being put in by those writers who make a success of the pulps, it's easy to see why it was not an attractive career move for everybody. Writing 3,000-4,000 words a day, trying to churn out multiple stories a week across multiple genres, just wasn't for everybody. I can't say I blame them. It's nice just that we have the stories. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm going to have to read some more romance. And I tick off yet another genre. Until next time, happy Valentine's Day.